because we're expecting quite a large online audience as well. I'm asked to tell you that the fire exits for this room are there, just round that corner there, and at the top of the stairs. And our assembly point is on Pritchard's Road, should there be a catastrophe. We're not planning one, I hope. We're just giving it a couple of minutes. I'm waiting for my cue before we go to the live stream, and you'll be able to watch this afterwards if you want to catch up on anything, or you have to go early or anything like that. So you'll give me the nod then, will you? When you
can give us the nod.
Are we?
Yeah, we're good to go.
Yeah, let's start. So we can officially start now. So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ed Day. I'm a clinical reader in addiction psychiatry, and I work here at the university. And in the other half of my job, I'm an NHS consultant psychiatrist working in the Solihull Integrated Addiction Service. And very kind of you to join us. Those of you in the room, welcome. And those of you online, also welcome. We have a system in place this afternoon for asking questions, and we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So what I'm proposing to do is we'll run through our three speakers, and then we'll have the Q&A at the end. But you can use Slido to ask questions at any point during the session, and that's for people in the room or people at home. So what you do is you get your laptop or your phone, you go to that URL, and you type in that hash code, and then that should take you to our dedicated page for this session, and then you can type in questions, as many as you like, and then my colleague Luke here will be collating them, and then at the end we'll be able to, the three of us and Luke, if necessary, will be able to answer them. The questions can be anonymous, or you can put your name on them, doesn't matter which way. So with Slido, it's quite a good system for being able to ask questions both here and at home. So without further ado, I'm going to kick off our session today, and we have three speakers. I'm one of them, but I'm joined by my two colleagues who've both come a long way to do this session in Birmingham today, from Essex and Dorset. Well, actually, I'll introduce them now because will follow along seamlessly in the presentation. So Steve Sharman is a gambling researcher who works at King's College in London. And Paula Hall is a psychotherapist who specialises in treating porn and sex addiction. And she has a practice in Leamington Spa, but now lives in Dorset, inconveniently, for this session. So Steve and Paula will follow on from me, but I'm just going to set the scene for this session, give you a bit of an introduction, and then I'll come back afterwards and talk about one of the services we offer to support people at the University of Birmingham. So, kick off with the question, what is addiction? Well, when I ask that question, most people assume what I'm talking about is some of that stuff. So drugs and alcohol is what people associate with addiction generally. And when I talk about this, I always try to put this in context. So I show this slide everywhere because this tries to demonstrate, if we think about drugs and alcohol, how people relate to those substances across the whole population. So in this slide, over on the left-hand side of the screen as you look, you've got people who perhaps either, let's consider alcohol, don't drink alcohol, or who use alcohol in a way that's entirely unproblematic for them. They drink and it enhances their life and it causes them no problems. At the far end of the spectrum, however, you've got a group of people who develop what in diagnostic terms we would call alcohol dependence, or that's what you'd know of as addiction. And these are the most severe problems that occur with these substances, and I'll talk more about what that entails as we go along. But that may be 1 in 20 people in the population have a problem to that degree of severity. The point is there's absolutely everything in between, from people that don't use at all at one end to people with severe problems at the other, and in between, the vast majority of the population lies somewhere on a spectrum in terms of engaging with those problems, with those substances. And they develop problems at different levels across that engagement. Some people develop problems with relatively low levels of consumption. Some people drink a lot more for a long period of time before it causes them issues. The problems it may cause might be physical, they might be psychological, or they might be social. So we're talking about quite a complicated issue that isn't really black and white. You're not addicted or not addicted, really, if the truth be told. So what are the features of addiction? Well, here are the medical diagnostic features, and let me break this down for you. So someone that I would diagnose as having an addiction or a dependence on, and again, I've given the example of alcohol here, but you can translate that term for other substances. At the top box there, they would have physiological correlates of use. So these are things like tolerance, which is being able to drink more alcohol than other people with it having less effect. So you're able to drink other people under the table. Craving, so a strong desire to use that doesn't, even at times when you don't necessarily want to. And the flip side of tolerance, which is symptoms of withdrawal. So when you stop using, your body is kind of accustomed to having high levels of the substance in it. When the substance is removed, you get a particular range of symptoms of withdrawal, and they vary from substance to substance. The second group of features are something to do with loss of control of alcohol. So that's the inability to stop drinking when you want to, drinking for longer than you intended to, drinking more than you wanted to, and being unsuccessful at your attempts to cut down. So we're currently in January with the Dry January campaign, which has run for many years. And what some people may be discovering when they're undertaking Dry January is that they just aren't actually able to stop drinking alcohol for whatever reason. So those group of features really, to me, define the core of what addiction is. Addiction is when you've lost control of something that was perhaps pleasurable or useful or nice before. You've lost control of it, and you develop a variety of problems around that. Now, the second half of the list really is about are some of the issues that occur to you when you use large amounts of a substance over a long period of time. So you can see that alcohol taking over meaningful activities, so you spend far more time drinking alcohol than you want to. It cuts into time when you should be doing other things, spending time with family or friends or studying or working. And you give up other activities because of your substance use as a sort of involuntary thing. And then finally, you get a whole range of problems resulting from that. So as it says there, a failure to fulfill role obligations, social or interpersonal problems, so losing relationships, falling out with your family, falling out with friends, physical problems, so alcohol causes a wide range of physical difficulties, which you're probably familiar with many of them, psychological problems, depression, anxiety, and starting to drink in situations when it's not safe to do so. And the classic one in the UK would always be drink driving as the first one of those. So those are the features, and you have to have a certain number of those. So in the United States, they'd use those criteria, and they'd say that you've got to have 3 of them to say that you've got a problem. If you have 5 of them, you've got a severe problem. But those are the sort of features that we're talking about when we talk about addiction. Now, often when people think about addiction, they think, well, what causes addiction? There's no way I can have addiction. Well, the truth is anyone could get addicted in theory. And why does it happen? Well, we think it's a combination, and it's one of these substances. Most medical disorders are a combination of genetic factors that you're born with and environmental factors that you come up against. It's usually a combination of those. Some disorders are much more genetic, some are more environmental. With addiction, it's probably a bit 50-50, to be honest. So there are certain people, if you have a strong family history of having addiction, you're more likely to develop those problems. But unless you come across a particular environmental situation or stressors, you probably won't develop that. So I often say to people, if you had a tendency to develop alcohol dependence, but you lived on a desert island where there was no access to alcohol ever, you wouldn't develop a problem with alcohol. But that's an extreme example. And what we often find increasingly is that people engage in use of these substances in a perfectly healthy and controlled way until they start developing life stresses of their own. So they get some form of trauma or difficulty, and they start using that drinking or that substance use to help them cope with those problems. Because then you get the as I'll show you, the problem of addiction then takes a life of its own, and there are changes to the brain which mean that the problems become self-perpetuating. So there's been a huge amount of neuroscientific research on addiction in the last 30 or 40 years, driven by mostly by the American government and the funding that they spend on this. And what that has shown is quite a clear understanding of how addiction affects the brain. And you're talking, I don't want you to go into great detail in reading these descriptions. What I'm showing you here are three broad areas of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is the bit that's the controlling section of the brain, the bit that makes us human, the bit that means that we can control our sort of primeval instincts. The basal ganglia are the opposite. They're the more basic, deeper lying areas that drive reward and memory and learnt behaviour. And then you've got the amygdala, which is really the sort of hub of emotion and anxiety. And what we know, and I'm grossly simplifying this, and you can read more about it in the reference that this is taken from, just in small text on that slide. But what we understand now is that there seems to be this routine process that occurs as addiction develops. So it starts with the blue phase at the top, which is when people are using a substance for its pleasurable effects. So again, we've been talking about alcohol. Alcohol has many pleasurable effects. It relaxes you. It makes you more sociable. It maybe helps you go to sleep. It reduces anxiety. If you keep using that alcohol again and again and again, eventually your body, as I mentioned earlier, becomes tolerant. So you stop getting that same effect and you have to use a bit more to get to that desired level of effect. And eventually you get to the second phase, which is where instead of drinking to get the pleasurable effects, you actually are drinking to just avoid the withdrawal effects. And with that goes a feeling of anxiety and low mood. Your brain almost recalibrates so that things that were pleasurable before that aren't drinking are no longer pleasurable because they've been completely taken over by alcohol. And then the final stage of this is changes to the executive function bit of the brain, the bit that controls the rest of it. So that with that sustained drinking, you get actual changes that you can see in a scanner in the frontal lobes of the brain, which show that there's been a change in your ability to control it. And this is where you're no longer controlling the alcohol, but the alcohol's controlling you. So what starts off very much as a non-conscious process eventually becomes something that's taken away, often what we think of the essence of being human, that you can control what you're doing. So, with all that in mind, why is this a session on behavioural addictions? Well, I've given you the exemplar, which is how we've gained a lot of this information over the last 30 or 40 years, and that's with alcohol and drugs. But we've known for a long time that certain other behaviours work in a similar way to all those processes that I've just described. So there's a list on there, and you're going to hear about the top two particularly today. But there are certain behaviours that are intrinsically rewarding that seem to act in a similar way to drugs and alcohol. So let's think about something like gambling. So these behaviours tend to start in young adulthood. So generally speaking, they occur between the age of 15 and 25, very similar to other addictions. They have a rewarding nature. Behaviours such as gambling are, as Steve will say more about in a minute, they're exciting and they're rewarding, and they give you that positive reinforcement. But as you go on, the more you do them, the more relentlessly you do them, the less reward you get from each episode of it, and you need to do more to get to the same level again. You start to develop that urge or craving to do the thing even when you don't want to do it. When you're doing something else, you're sitting in a lecture, you're getting an urge or a craving, a drive to go and gamble, if that's the example we're talking about. Doing these sort of things increase your level of anxiety and reduce your mood. You get a decrease in positive mood effects with the repeated behaviour, as I say, and you need to up the amount you're doing it to get the rewards you got originally. Although you don't get the clear medical withdrawal symptoms that you might with alcohol and other drugs, you certainly get a feeling that's well described of anxiety or tension or restlessness when you stop doing the behaviour. If you manage to go cold turkey and stop altogether, you get those feelings. And people do these behaviours to such an extent that they start jeopardising other areas of their life. They start ruining relationships, jobs, earnings, and so on. So what we're describing here is is a scientific model that's been built over 40 years, which is based on the sort of the latest techniques of neuroscience, looking at particularly drugs and alcohol. But this is now being extended to these other behaviours, and it turns out that there are an enormous amount of similarities between the two. So that's my introduction to that's a very broad introduction. I'm going to hand over to Steve now, who's going to talk about gambling as the first one of these behaviours. And Steve, I think, is going to talk a bit about the research that he does at King's, and I think it's research that may well interest many people in this audience. And then Paula's going to take over and talk about, so Paula's a clinician, and she's going to talk about her work treating people with porn addiction. And then I'll come back at the end to draw it all together and tell you a bit about services we offer here before we open it up to the Q&A. So Steve, if you're ready, don't forget you can ask those questions at any time, and we'll bring them to the Q&A at the end. Just hand over to you.
Thanks, Ed. Right, hi everyone. Hello everyone online. Thank you very much for having me here today to talk about this. As Ed said, my name's Steve Sharman. I'm a research fellow at the National Addiction Centre, part of King's College London. I specialise in behavioural addictions and particularly gambling, some other areas as well, but gambling is where my research is primarily focused. So I'm going to talk to you mainly about gambling today, and particularly focus on one element of the way that addictive disorders can sometimes develop, and that's particularly the environment in which the behaviour is performed. And the environment which we are exposed to. So before I get going, I do just want to start off with a little bit of a warning. Now, obviously, being a gambling-related talk, there is going to be quite a lot of gambling imagery in this talk. So if that is problematic from anyone, you can maybe just listen rather than look. And also, there will be some kind of help options given at the end. Oh, that's gone the wrong way, isn't it? There we go. That's better. Okay, so we'll start with just a brief overview of gambling in the UK. So in the UK, we have a really permissive gambling environment at the moment. There are so many different forms of gambling available. You know, we have casinos that are rammed full of slot machines and roulette tables. We have high street bookmakers that offer some of the more traditional forms, such as horse racing and dog racing. But they also incorporate newer things like new fixed odds betting terminals. You can now bet on sports in play on terminals in shops. And they also have things like virtual sports, which I still can't quite get my head around why people would want to gamble on, but it is surprisingly popular. We have tons of things like scratch cards, lotteries, bingos, offline, online poker. The list, it goes on. We also have it at our fingertips, always. Like almost everyone has a mobile phone or a laptop or a tablet, meaning that if the person is so inclined, you can pretty much gamble on anything at any time, 24 hours a day. So what I always like to ask at this stage, and this doesn't work quite so well when the people are here virtually and not here in the room, but if you're comfortable doing so, put your hand up if you've gambled on anything in the last 12 months. See, I always put my hand up to this because I gamble most weekends on football because I think I know about it, but apparently when you look at the outcomes of my bets, I know nothing about football. But around 50% of adults, and that was kind of reflected maybe roughly in this room, around 50% of UK adults generally have gambled in the last year. We actually know that there's quite a lot of research that shows that actually that's higher in student populations, and particularly can be high in student populations that are associated with sports clubs. I've got another question that I want to ask you. You can shout out an answer if you want, but you don't have to if you don't want to. How much do you think gamblers in Great Britain lost between April 2021 and March 2022? So in a 12-month period, how much money do you think gamblers lost?
Gamblers in the UK?
In Great Britain?
More than I'm imagining.
It's almost invariably more than you're imagining. So the answer is £14.1 billion. £14.1 billion. And that's not spent and then you win some back. That figure is what's called the gross gambling yield. So that is even after all winning bets are paid out, that is how much is lost, £14.1 billion. It's a 10% increase from the year before. And we really still are trying to figure out the effects of lockdown on that, because obviously there was this period of time during lockdown where there was no football all of a sudden. So there was this whole group of people that would gamble on horses or dogs or football that suddenly had nothing to gamble on. But it didn't affect things so much like anything that you can access online. So it's not really surprising that there's a lot of gambling in this country when you consider the amount of gambling marketing we're exposed to, and it's that I really want to focus on today. But first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about disordered gambling. So what happens when gambling starts to cause harm? Well, when gambling becomes something that starts to cause harm, it can either affect the individual, it can affect other people, and there are certain clinical thresholds that have to be met for an individual to be considered to be suffering from a gambling disorder. Now, in the most recent version of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, they coined this new term called disordered gambling. Right? So we used to have, or we still have, all these diagnostic tools that will either be, they'll either label you as a problem gambler, a pathological gambler, a probable pathological gambler, and you have all these different terms that mean more or less the same thing. So DSM introduced this term disordered gambling, which, whilst again it's not exactly ideal as a term to use, it is kind of better than trying to use all those different terms separately for the same thing. So I am going to refer to disordered gambling. Now, the DSM criteria for gambling cover many of the same aspects as you might expect to see for substance use disorders. So we have things like withdrawal, preoccupation, failure to stop, loss of control, many of the things that Ed's just mentioned previously. But we do have a couple that are unique to behavioural addictions and particularly unique to gambling. Particularly, one of the strongest indicators is something called chasing losses. So obviously, if you're using a substance, you kind of use that substance and then you get your reward, and then it's kind of over. But whereas with gambling, if you gamble and you lose the money, you don't have to stop if you've got more money. So you keep going and you're trying to win that money back that you've already lost, and that's called chasing losses, and that's always seen as a very important predictor of gambling problems or of disordered gambling. That's a kind of a behaviour that's fairly unique in an addiction sense to gambling. Now, you have to endorse 4 or more of the criteria in a 12-month period to indicate a presence of a gambling disorder. What the most recent classification system from the DSM does offer as well is that it recognises that gambling isn't something that is necessarily something that people are consistently involved in. It can be persistent. So people, if you ask them at any point in the 12 months, they would kind of exhibit many of the symptoms. But it can also be episodic. So we know from working with treatment-seeking gamblers that there can be periods of time where they will gamble very intensely, lose a lot of money. If you gave them a questionnaire and said, tick some of these criteria, they would tick loads of them. But then they can go a couple of months without gambling and they can stop. And it's sort of, they come out of it. And it's only when they start again, kind of get at the top of that slope and start gambling more and end up binge gambling, that they slip back into problematic gambling. And that's really interesting that we're able to kind of differentiate between the persistent and the episodic kind of engagement with gambling behaviour. So how common is it? How common is gambling disorder? Well, there's different tools that are used to measure, different survey instruments. That's the British Gambling Prevalence Survey, the Health Survey for England. The Gambling Commission do some of their own statistics. And as you can see, it's kind of under 1%. It's remained kind of stable. If anything, it's kind of gone down over the last few years. But there's quite a lot of issues with these figures and the way they're collected. Now, as far as I'm aware, they're all done initially at least by telephone. There's 1 per household. So, you know, if you've got 3 people who gamble a lot in a household and you speak to the 1 person who doesn't, it's going to count as nobody gambles in that household. It also completely ignores places of mass occupancy dwellings. So prisons, homeless hostels, student halls of residence, all places that literature has shown us will have elevated levels of gambling problems, just misses them out altogether. So you can start to see there's some problems with this 1%. There's also the issue of disclosure, because there's a big lack of spontaneous and self-disclosure in gambling. So we know that people with gambling problems are highly unlikely to actually talk about it, which again is quite difficult when you're trying to figure out how many people actually do it. It's also just the tip of the iceberg if you're looking at those people who tick all the diagnostic criteria, or at least 4 of the diagnostic criteria. We know that if you look at people who are experiencing harm, so going back to that kind of spectrum of harm that Ed was talking about earlier, it's only people right at that end, right at the, I don't know which way you're looking at it, the extreme end of harm are the ones that would make up that 1%. But there's also this whole group of people that experience harm but don't make it through to what we would use as a clinical threshold for a gambling disorder. And if you think about those people as well, that's up to another 7% of the population. So you can see that the number of people that are affected by gambling starts to grow. There's then literature that shows that for every disordered gambler, their behaviours impact between 5 and 10 other people. Now, this can either be through damage to family members, through losing a job, through stealing from work, through other crimes committed, affect up to 5 to 10 others. So again, you start to see that this is not a small problem. This is something that can affect a lot of people. So, I want to get through and talk a little bit about gambling, the environment of gambling, and particularly the relationship between gambling and football. So football is really one of the major ways that gambling is promoted in this country. It's in the media a lot. We're going through this massive gambling review at the moment, and there's been some calls for gambling advertising and sponsorship to be banned completely. To ward off some potential strong regulation, the industry did some self-regulation through something they call the whistle-to-whistle ban. So the whistle-to-whistle ban basically means there's no gambling adverts from 5 minutes before kickoff to 5 minutes after kickoff in a live televised football game. And the industry said it was a great success, and this is some of their headline stats from their report. The gambling adverts seen by children were down 97%. Gambling adverts views down in total were down 1.7 billion, and there was a 78% decline in total gambling advertising exposure, which sounds great, right? You'd think, wow, that's an industry intervention that has done really well in reducing how people are exposed to gambling marketing. But then when you dig a little deeper into what this actually means, you start to understand that perhaps it's all is quite not what it seems. So we did a little bit of work looking at around the adverts during the Euro 2020, even though it was in Euro 2021, but Euro 2020. We looked basically at the frequency of and content of adverts. So there were 113 adverts recorded across all the live games shown on ITV during that tournament. They had an average of 4.5 adverts per match. And what was really interesting is that because of the whistle-to-whistle ban, most of these adverts come before the games have kicked off. And they're mainly financial inducements, so things like free bets, boosted odds, and they also have things like request a bet, and then some of them are just brand awareness, and the very, very smallest category is adverts to promote safer gambling. So we've also followed this up with a study on 2022, the Qatar World Cup coverage in 2022, which I can't talk about too much because we're still analysing that data at the moment, but the patterns are the same. Most of the adverts come before kickoff. They don't care about the 5 minutes before kickoff. The industry is interested in that kind of half an hour window before kickoff where there'll be up to 6, 7, 8 adverts per game, and they're all saying these are the odds on the game that's about to happen, these are the special sign-up offers, these are the special odds. So what they're interested in actually is getting to you and taking your money before the game starts. Once the game started, they're far less interested in advertising to you. So the whistle-to-whistle ban arguably didn't really impact what the gambling industry wanted to do anyway. They've just made themselves look like they're doing something. However, when you then come back to the Premier League, so these is a series of pictures taken from Premier League games over the last year or two. So this is what it's like when you're watching a game on TV. This is advertising on the advertising boards around the pitch. This is on for most of the 90 minutes. Some of them, like Wolves, if you ever watch any games that are live at Wolves, on one side they have 3 boards facing the cameras, and there's sometimes all 3 boards will be advertising different gambling companies at the same time. So there's a lot of gambling exposure like that. In this picture taken, so this is David Moyes at West Ham. It's pretty much human skin and the linesman's shirt are like the only things that don't have a Betway logo on. There's 23 individual Betway logos in that particular picture. And I don't know if you remember, or if you pay any interest, or if you remember, there was a Prince William and Princess Kate went to watch a game at West Ham, and they were photographed sitting in the seats with the Betway logo on, and there caused a bit of a kerfuffle in our world at the time because everyone was saying Prince William was promoting Betway, which obviously he wasn't, but they should have been a bit smarter with what they were pictured in. This is then a picture of a post-game interview with the then Stoke manager Michael O'Neill. Again, there's 30 separate gambling logos in that picture. So all the time we're being told, whistle to whistle ban, look, there's no gambling advertising. You've got the boards around the pitch. You've got the Betway stuff that's on the seats and on the steps. You have this in the post-game interviews. And then obviously also, you have, shirt sponsors. So this is from the Premier League this year. There's only 8 teams, well, I say only, there's 8 teams in the Premier League this season that are sponsored by gambling companies. That's actually a reduction over the last couple of years, but it's still pretty high, and it's still, what we're seeing at the moment is the largest saturation of one industry sponsoring teams in the top 2 divisions in this country that we've ever had. There's more gambling companies than there's ever been any other industry. And I'm hoping these little videos work, because I just wanted to show this as well. So this is, if these videos work. So this is again how gambling has just become normalised within sporting culture. So if I look at LiveScore, right? So LiveScore is an app where you just look at scores. You look at football scores. They're not even always football scores, just other sports scores. But if you search, this is the other ads that come up as apps related to it. They are all gambling companies. I think there's 12 different gambling companies that are what the Android App Store thinks is related to LiveScore. You can then look at the BBC one as well. So BBC is even more general. This has appeal to children. We know that it's not an age-restricted app, so children will be looking at this. And this is what the Android app says is related to it. They're all gambling companies, which is, again, a good reflection of how gambling has kind of become normalised within football culture and sporting culture. Also, I think it's the last thing I want to talk about is social media and how gambling companies interact on social media, because this is something that we've not really looked at in any huge amount of detail, and it's something that I find extremely interesting. So gambling companies will tweet like this, and it doesn't count as an advert, because obviously it's not an advert, it's just a tweet. So they do things like this. So Paddy Power, okay, let's have a prediction. Or they'll say, oh, look, there's a bit of information. Here's a statistic. Or it's a poll. But it's all designed to drive engagement with the brand. There's no odds. There's no encouragement to gamble. It's all engaging with the brand and with the particular tweets. But then this one happens. Oh, not that one. This one happens. This one happens. There. So, same thing in the same thread. They'll be talking about, they'll have some crack, have some banter, have some football chat, and then suddenly, bam, here's the odds. Why don't you sign up with us? Come and gamble. And that's the way that social media, gambling companies interact on social media. And it's not quite stealth marketing, but it's something that really slips through the regulatory and legislative cracks at the moment, because they're just tweets and they're not directly advertising until they get to this point where they say, sign up, come and we'll take your money. So, I can probably come into towards the end. So anyway, in terms of gambling disorder, it's really interesting. Even now, as a researcher, sometimes I will face a situation where, for people generally people find it much easier to understand a substance use disorder. They'll say, if you say, I've got a cocaine problem or an alcohol problem, that's easy for people to understand because there's something to be addicted to. With behaviours, the thing we hear most often, time and time again, which is really, really annoying, which is, oh, why don't you just stop? As if it's that simple that you can just go, oh, do you know what, I'm not going to gamble anymore, put my phone away and it's done. And it's often portrayed sometimes as kind of some sort of deficiency within the individual, and that's not what it is. But we are currently, because of this environment, we're currently in an environment where gambling is really, really hard to escape. However, if someone is experiencing problems with gambling, there are things that can be done straight away. We know from loads of work with treatment providers that with gamblers, receiving money is one of the most stressful times. So if you know you've got benefits coming in, if you know you've got a payday, it's particularly interesting around students, because often with students, it was definitely the case when I was a student, you don't get money for ages, and then suddenly you do, and you get a chunk, and the temptation is then to just go and spend straight away and then have none left. And that's something that we know is a particularly stressful time. So you can make plans around kind of access to money, which can always be useful. If people are experiencing gambling problems, there is blocking software you can put on laptops, you can put on phones, which means you physically can't access any gambling sites. Well, that's the idea if you have things like Gamblock or Gamban. If it's in-person stuff you do, you can self-exclude. There's problems with the self-exclusion program because you kind of generally have to go around and do it individually. You have to actually go into the place that maybe causes the problem before you can actually say, I don't want to come in here anymore, which isn't great. There are then other things for support, things like Gamblers Anonymous, and other national settings. There's support within the university, which I think Ed will maybe talk about more. Then, like I say, there's things like Gamblers Anonymous. There is the National Gambling Helpline, and then there is things like GamCare, which offers online support. So I think that was pretty much everything I wanted to say about gambling. Thanks everyone for listening, and I'll be happy to take your questions when we have the panel session afterwards. So thanks very much.
Hello. Hello online as well. So, right, going to liven things up a bit by talking about sex and pornography, which is obviously why you're all here really anyway, and why they left me till last. Right, I'm looking there. Sorry, I've got a really irritating cough. I promise it's not COVID, tested. This is leftover flu thing. So yeah, I'm a psychotherapist. I've been a therapist for 30 years, and I've been specialising in sex and porn addiction for about 15 years now. And business is booming. Thanks to Apple, thanks to technology, business is absolutely booming. There is no doubt this is the fastest growing compulsive behaviour that we have at the moment. It's outstripped gambling, it's outstripped gaming, and unlike most other issues, the side effects are actually much, much harder to notice. At least with gambling, you run out of money. I've yet to meet anyone who's run out of sex drive. So let me, what's this going to, so I've got 20 minutes, going to talk a little bit about what it is. Really useful actually going last, because there's going to be so many similarities to what you've already heard anyway. So I think a lot of this is going to already make sense for you. Also going to talk a bit about how you know if you've got a problem, and finally, how you get over it. So what is it? So it's an unhealthy dependency on a mood-altering behaviour, and of course you could use that definition for anything that we've been talking about. I guess the thing that I would want to emphasise, I don't think there's anything wrong with using sex, porn, masturbation, got to be blunt here with wording, to alter your mood, yeah? In the same way as I don't think there's anything wrong with having a glass of wine to alter my mood occasionally, and maybe I have too much on some occasions. The problem is when you have a primary dependency on it, when it is the only way that you can actually alter your mood. It's when you become dependent on it. Another thing that's really critical about this, the type of behaviour is not what defines it as an addiction, but the dependency on it. So when I'm talking about porn addiction or sex addiction, I'm including getting into the webcam stuff, getting into the chat rooms, dating apps, adult apps, visiting masseurs, sex workers, casual sex, cruising. If I was talking about alcohol, it would make no difference whether or not you were dependent on whiskey or actually you were much more of a beer drinker. It's the dependency on how it makes you feel that defines it as an addiction, and the same is true around sex and porn. It's not actually specifically the behaviour itself. I've got a little video to show you about the neuroscience of addiction, and I think I'd be really interested to get your feedback, Steve and Ed, because I think this would probably follow for precisely the stuff that you've been talking about, but more in layman's terms, perhaps. It's about 4 minutes long.
Our brains are full of neural maps. Every time we learn something, we create a new neural map in our brain. So, for example, you might have a neural map about cooking a meal. You may have a neural map that is around learning French or maybe learning to drive. And in fact, the more you practice that skill, the deeper that map becomes, the stronger it becomes in our brain, to the point where you don't even have to think about it very much anymore. So initially, when you started learning to drive the car, you had to think very consciously about where the gear stick was and where the accelerator and the brake was. But over time, as that neural map in your brain becomes stronger and stronger, those actions and behaviours just become automatic. Now, unfortunately, that also happens with addiction. Sex addiction rewires the brain. It creates a new neural map. And one of the key things that helps us remember those maps is a chemical called dopamine. Dopamine is a chemical that is the common denominator in all addiction. It's a chemical that reminds us of the things that are most pleasurable in our lives. So something that triggers dopamine is something that is going to strengthen your neural map. So thinking of perhaps the map of England as a metaphor, imagine Brighton represents your addiction. Brighton represents your acting out behaviour. As someone who's been to Brighton, I know that it's a lovely place. It's very exciting. It's full of lots of different things to do. Somewhere you can lose yourself. Perhaps that's also true of your addiction. London represents everyday life. So you live in London, it's where your everyday life happens. But when you want a dopamine high, you go to Brighton. Now, if you go to Brighton on a regular basis in your addiction, if your acting out has become a regular thing that you do, then that neural pathway in your brain is going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. The more often you drive down that neural pathway, the stronger it will become, the more automatic it will become, like when you learn to drive a car. So that neural pathway in your brain, that road from London to Brighton, becomes a motorway. It becomes the M23, a fast, easy route to access dopamine. Recovery from addiction means not going to Brighton. And it means not thinking about Brighton either, because we know that when you fantasize, you actually trigger the dopamine pathway in the same way. You need never to go to Brighton again so that that motorway can begin to get potholed and grow over. It will become weaker and weaker. But instead, you need to develop new roads, new ways of accessing dopamine. So let's think of some other coastal towns. Perhaps Portsmouth is going to represent another way you can access dopamine. That might be going out with friends. Maybe Littlehampton is playing golf. Maybe Eastbourne is taking up a new musical instrument. Maybe spending more time with family and friends, with loved ones is Bournemouth. Initially, when you start trying to access those neural pathways, they're going to be little B roads, and you might find yourself having to go to Bournemouth via Leeds. It may take a long time to get to that point of dopamine. And I'm sorry to say, but it's not going to be quite like Brighton. But if you're tempted to go back to Brighton again, you are just going to strengthen that neural pathway. What you have to do is keep going to Bournemouth, keep going to Portsmouth, keep accessing those other types of dopamine so that those roads can become stronger and stronger and stronger.
There you go, neuroscience in a nutshell. So I've got nothing against Brighton. I'm from Brighton originally. Anybody that lives in Brighton, please do feel free to go back to Brighton. But I think in many respects, addiction is just learnt behaviour. Yeah, the reason we get addicted to stuff is because we practice it so much. You get very proficient at it because you practice it all the time. It's slightly different in as much as dopamine means that we store information in a slightly different way. But that really is it. And if you want to stop being good at playing a musical instrument or your addiction or whatever it is, you need to stop practicing on such a regular basis. Okay? So people can watch this afterwards. That's the link to it. You can find that video on YouTube if it's useful. So there's also a psychology as well as a biology of all the addictions we've been talking to, including porn. And I think, broadly speaking, all behaviours are anaesthetics. They're a way of numbing out difficult, uncomfortable emotions and feelings. So that could be boredom, stress and anxiety, anger and frustration, fear and loss. I mean, frankly, you can put anything, depression, shame, loneliness, low self-esteem. It becomes a way of avoiding it, and I really liked the cycle that was there before. After it starts off as that, but after a while, what you're actually trying to avoid is the craving. And I guess that's the hallmark of addiction, is craving. It's not, oh, I quite fancy. It's pacing up and down, preoccupied, would leave other important events in order to get a hit of it. The thing I do want to say, which actually isn't part of this, but I think is a really important distinction to make, Addiction, all addictions happen in the brain. This is about arousal and dependency that happens in the brain, not in the genitals. Okay? This is not about sexual desire. This is not about sexual arousal. If we were talking about food addiction, if we were talking about chronic obesity, excuse me, and food addiction, that doesn't come from hunger. Yeah? No one is chronically obese because they are hungrier than other people. They are eating for comfort, not because of appetite. So sex and porn addiction do not come from sexual appetite. It is not based on testosterone that comes from the genitals, slightly different for women, but kind of same thing. It's about the arousal, the dopamine arousal that happens in the brain. So how do you know you've got it? Exactly the same stuff as we've talked about. Increasingly preoccupied with either planning to watch porn or get online or whatever it is, actually watching porn or recovering from watching porn. I think the other key distinguisher here about how you know if you're a problem, if you're watching porn because you're horny, or whatever term you want to use, if it's coming from sexual desire and that's why you're watching porn, this is not it's a rhetorical question, how long does it take? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour if you're really treating yourself? Yeah, it doesn't, and then it's game over, done, move on, get on with the rest of your day, whatever it is. Yeah? But actually, when you've developed an addiction, you will be online, you will be postponing orgasm, which is a very odd thing to do if it's actually coming from desire. But you will be postponing, because you don't want game to be over. Yeah? It's not an addiction to orgasm, it's an addiction to the distraction and the preoccupation with the material. Can't stop in spite of significant impacts that it's having, maybe on your social life, maybe on finances if you're on the paid for stuff now, maybe to do with relationships. I guess it turning up in relationships and certainly other sexual dysfunctions and problems is the most common thing that gets people's attention, frankly. Finding you need to spend more and more time online, or more and more novelty, so your porn tastes are beginning to morph, you've gone into the chat stuff, you've gone into the paid-for stuff, you might have gone into watching porn that's actually not the same as your sexual orientation. And the thing is, we know is that novelty spikes dopamine. Yeah? Same with food as well. It doesn't matter how much you love Battenberg cake, goodness knows where that came from. Doesn't matter how much you love Battenberg cake, you're not going to want it 3 times a day for the rest of your life. Yeah, exactly the same happens with pornography. You need the novelty to keep spiking dopamine. And the reason, of course, it's so addictive now is because of the smartphone, because of the access online. In olden days, when you had to go to a shop and buy pornography, frankly, you wouldn't be able to turn the pages fast enough to get addicted. Your brain would just go, oh, forget it. So it really is, it's that ongoing, constant novelty that spikes dopamine and keeps the system going. Another sign, you get struggling to get aroused in partnered sex. And, I mean, this is number one symptom of all addictions. You've tried to stop, you've tried to cut down, and repeatedly failed. So, how do you get over it? Choice recovery models. Let me introduce you to this. I completely agree with what Ed was saying. There are degrees of this. Clearly, there are millions of people who can recreationally use porn and sex and not have any problem at all. And then there are some where it's becoming problematic. It's a bit heavy. I think I need to cut down a bit. I think I need to get a grip, excuse the pun. And then, of course, there are those where it definitely has become really problematic. So I guess as a psychotherapist, I'm talking more about the people who have repeatedly tried to stop and failed and are more at that kind of treatment end. So choice recovery model, and I'd like to say, why don't you just stop? Another definition of addiction that's often talked about is that it's actually a disorder of choice. That the changes that happen in the prefrontal cortex in the decision-making part of the brain become weaker and weaker, whilst the seeking of rewards that happen in another part of the brain becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. So actually, over a period of time, addiction robs you of choice, and it's all about getting that back. So this is an acrostic that helps to remember the stages of recovery, but I think it's also a philosophy for me as well. So the first C stands for challenge faulty core beliefs. And that really is about why can't you just stop? What do you tell yourself? I'm too weak, I'm too weird, I'm too lonely, I'll never get into a relationship, I'm just got no self-control. What are the messages that you're telling yourself that tend to sabotage it? What is it that gets in the way of your motivation? So it's important to be able to really explore what some of that stuff might be. Have a vision. What is your life going to be like without this? And I think, again, there's one of the challenges, particularly if you've been kind of brought up with internet porn, which of course a lot of people have. Actually, imagining a life without this is really quite tough. And actually, how will my life be without this? And again, to be clear, this is not how will my life be without sex. Yeah, it's much more like a food addiction than the other addictions. If you want to give up substance addiction or gambling, stop. Abstinence is the best approach. This is not about abstinence. Yeah, recovering from an eating disorder is about changing your relationship to food and developing a healthy relationship with food. Getting over sex and porn addiction is about changing your relationship with your sexuality. Your sex life should be better getting into recovery, not worse. So helping you to really build a sense of who you are and what the life is that you want to have without this compulsion. Overcome the compulsive behaviours. So how do you do that? And I think this ties into something that Steve was saying, actually. It was quite interesting. So this is the model that I use, a cycle of addiction. Really common, acting out whatever that means to you, whether that's being online looking at porn, whether that's chat rooms, whether it's the dating apps, whatever it might be. After that, often there's a period of regret. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, I've got to get up in 2 hours, I've got to get to that conference, whatever it is. Often there's a time of putting things back together again, right? Putting the porn blockers back on, not doing that again, new regime, back to the exercise, back to this, that and the other. But often going into a dormant phase, and I think from what Steve was saying, that happens with gambling as well. So some people will have quite long periods, well, might only be a few weeks, but when actually they feel on top of it. They actually feel like, actually, I'm getting a handle on this now. But often, unless you've really, really worked out what's going on underneath, what the motivation is, what's driving it, what it is you're anaesthetising against, and you've developed healthy coping mechanisms, it's only a matter of time before you're triggered again. And the triggers are likely to be either emotional or environmental. And the environmental triggers, I mean, fascinating looking at the stuff where, and I don't even see all that betting adverts. I will now. I don't even see it. It's just wallpaper. But I think we're exactly the same with a lot of porn and stuff like that now. We often just don't see it. It's just in the background. So there may be environmental triggers, emotional triggers. Then you go into kind of a preparation phase where you're building up to acting out again. I shouldn't, I should. Everybody does it. I'll only be on for 5 minutes. Well, I'll give up when I've finished my exams. Oh, I'll do, all that stuff, January. But you just keep on going around. And the thing is that overcoming the behaviours is really about getting off that cycle. The I is about identifying positive sexuality. Like I said, it's not about abstinence. It's about identifying what is positive, healthy masturbation for you, relationship sex for you, whatever that might mean, because it's not about abstinence. It's about actually finding something that's going to be positive and enjoyable for you. Connecting with others, we know that often it is much, much easier to get over addictions if you do it with other people that are supportive, and I suspect that this is something that Ed will pick up on when he's talking about the student resources, and establishing confident recovery. And really establishing confident recovery is, if you're not going to go to Brighton, you're not going to look at pictures of Brighton, and you're not going to fantasise about Brighton. It's making sure you know where Bournemouth is, Littlehampton is, Eastbourne is. There are other towns apart from southern ones, by the way. But you really get a much, much richer, wider, more enjoyable life. So actually, you just don't miss Brighton anymore. It's something you use. I used to smoke years ago. In fact, I went past somewhere in Birmingham today, and I went, I've been down that road. And I remembered I was going to a conference like this, I think, as my years when I was smoking. I didn't want to be caught smoking on campus, so I snuck down there and had a fag outside my car before getting back in the car and driving. That's the lengths I used to go to when I was a smoker. Weird. Never do that now, thankfully. Finally, final slide. Just want to make you aware of this. So I've just started a new not-for-profit service called Pivotal Recovery. So it's at pivotalrecovery.org, and we are doing a free pilot study, and we would be delighted if you would like to join the free pilot study. Follow that link. Hopefully this is going to be available somewhere to students as well, and I can certainly send out information. But it's completely anonymous, it's completely confidential, and you can join the pilot study completely for free. So normally Pivotal Recovery will cost 75 quid, but this is a 100% confidential pilot study, which is going to help us to really demonstrate that this can work, particularly within the student community, and then I'm going to be hounding universities to fund it. That's the cunning plan, but kind of need lots of people signing up to the pilot study first. So please, 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 if this is a problem that's affecting you or anybody that you know, do signpost them to that. Done. Are we sitting here now for Q&A?
Just, I'll call you up in a minute, Paula. Thank you. Well, thank you so much to Steve and Paula. That really, I didn't know exactly what they were going to say, but couldn't have said something better that fits together. I hope that's given you a flavour of those two particular issues and some of the key concerns, and ending on a positive note there with an offer of help. Don't forget that the opportunity to ask questions is still there. So there's for those of you who are late in or just joining online, if you go to slido.com and put in that hashtag, you can ask questions to the panel at the end of my closing talk here. And you can do that anonymously or with your name on whatever you feel most comfortable with. We will be making this presentation available afterwards, and I will share my contact details as the sort of person at the university if you want to get further information or you want me to put you in touch with Paula or Steve. So I just wanted to finish up we've talked a lot about addiction, but I now need to talk about recovery. Because at the University of Birmingham, we are actually the first university-led collegiate recovery program for addiction in the UK. In fact, in Europe. There are two others that my friend and colleague Dot Smith's organisation, Recovery Connections, has started at the University of Teesside and Sunderland, but we're the sort of pioneering place. And I need to talk about recovery because you've heard that term mentioned, but recovery isn't just about control over your problematic behaviour or substance. It's about a lot more than that. When you have this severe condition, as you've heard us describe, the extreme end, the far side of my diagram at the beginning, with all those issues where you've lost control, you can no longer put the brakes on when you need to, it's starting to cause really significant problems in your life. The trouble is when you get to that stage, because of the brain science we've outlined, things are spiralling downwards. Everything is getting worse. It's very, very hard to stop. All your attempts at stopping seem to make you more stressed, and the best way of relieving that stress is to go back to whatever the behaviour was before. So it can get really, really difficult. And often this is portrayed as a sort of desperate, endless problem that will never be resolved. But nothing could be further from the truth. There's very good evidence that even people with the most severe addiction, the majority of them will achieve a state of recovery. So what do I mean by recovery? Because recovery isn't just about controlling the behaviour, as I say. And this diagram gives you a summary of a sort of group of British experts that looked at this a few years ago, particularly in relation to drugs. And what you'll see on this is that one part of it is control over the substance or behaviour. So in many people's cases, that's total abstinence. But as you've heard, that's not necessarily the case with behaviours. If your problem is with food, obviously total abstinence is not an option that's available to you. But recovery is about far more than that. In order to get back up that downward spiral, back to where you were before, back to the point where you're just now dealing with the problem that led you to start that behaviour in the first place, you need something much bigger, and that is recovery. So the other two elements of recovery are good mental and physical health, and also what I've called their satisfying and meaningful life, involvement in the rights, roles and responsibilities of society, a reason to get up in the morning, all those things. And the reason this is all important, if you consider the idea, again, as I talked about with, say, alcohol problems. So say you have a significant problem with alcohol. If you never left the house, never spoke to anyone, didn't go on your phone, didn't go online, didn't watch the television, you could totally avoid alcohol and you'd never have a problem again. But would you have any form of life? No. So recovery is about the mental well-being and the physical well-being that allows you to live life in a world that's saturated with alcohol, gambling, sex, and live that life in a completely happy and satisfactory way that anyone else does, just minus the problem substance. And that is eminently achievable. The trouble is, it often takes quite a bit of work and quite a bit of support. So you'll see on there several of the key facets of the concept of recovery. There's no one way of doing it. Everyone's recovery is different. There's no one technique or method to use. Every person has a different story. Recovery means something different to every person. That's the first key point. It's a process. It takes time. You effectively have to work at it every day. But that isn't a chore. That's a positive thing. That's what the well-being world and the wellness world, that there are, if you went on Amazon and looked at the top-selling books every week, they'd all be about wellness and living a life. That's really no different. That business of trying to live a satisfying and happy life in the sort of hectic world that we live, that's one element of it. But it often needs aspirations and hope, because people have very negative views about people. You've heard a little bit, there's a heavy stigma about things, drug addiction or alcohol addiction. People don't want to talk about it. It's somehow shaming. Probably even worse for things like gambling and sex and porn addiction, because they're much less visible, as we've heard. And very often people, the first a partner will know about their partner's severe gambling problem is when the house has been remortgaged and lost, and literally nothing else was known about it. So we have to surround ourselves with daily reminders of positiveness and hope and aspiration as we move forward into recovery. It always involves connection. It's often said that the opposite of addiction is connection. Connecting, you've heard it several times already, connecting with other people is the way out of this. Addiction is an incredibly isolating condition to get into. When you're in the midst of that addiction, you've broken all your bonds and your ties with other people, and you need to reverse that. Otherwise, it won't work. And we think about, one way you can think about this is remission of the problem, i.e. the behaviour, getting the behaviour under control. But also the other part is building what we call recovery capital. So that's all those things in your life that help you live a fulfilling and satisfying life, even without the problem behaviour. So recovery is a positive thing. It's not something you hear people talk about, but certainly in the United States, there's a huge movement. It's estimated there are 23 million people in recovery from addiction in the United States. We've recently done a survey in the UK, a nationally representative survey looking at different problems. So we asked people, have you ever had a problem with drugs or alcohol? No longer do. And you've got something like 1 in 20 people saying that's the case. If you ask them specifically about behavioural addictions, it's more like 1 in 10 people. So there are lots and lots of people out there in recovery. So why am I talking about all this? Because now I bring it back to here, in that students, so when you think in the UK, the normal age for attending university, the majority of people are aged between 18 and 21. It's the standard age. But of course, there are a wide range of students on other courses, so students that are older when they go to university and students that are doing postgraduate courses who are a bit older. But generally speaking, that period of your life is a really challenging transitional period. You're going from being a child, perhaps living at home under the control or dependent on your parents, to having a lot more independence, to having to direct your own life, having to make your own friends, having to be responsible for basic daily activities, learning how to use a washing machine for the first time. All these things happen when you're in this phase. And the trouble is, if you're in recovery or you're entering recovery at that point, that you've just come out of this problem, the university can be an incredibly toxic environment for that. If you think about drugs, alcohol, and increasingly all these other behaviours. And in fact, I'm thinking that sitting there, that the generation of students at university now, Generation Z, are known as iGen. They're the generation that have known nothing but the smartphone and constant internet access and social media. And as you can see, the big business has worked out how to latch on to that technology to absolutely surround you with it at all times. As you were both saying, I reflect back to certainly when I was a student back in the dark ages of the last millennium. I lived for 2 years next door to a bookmaker's, and I used to go in and bet 50p or whatever it was. That was a fortune in those days. 50p on some 4 Italian football matches on a Saturday afternoon. But you just have to go into the dank, smoky, pretty grotty betting shop, get one of those little pencils, fill out the form, put your bet on. It was a lot of effort to do that. Nowadays, you just go like this, and you're there. You've got a casino in your pocket at all times. The world is awash with those markers of gambling and sex and all the other issues that we're talking about. So it's a great challenge for your generation or students that are at university. And yet the university is the beating heart of recovery capital in many ways. The university, if you go to university and you get a university degree, you're much more likely to get a better paid job. We want people at university. Universities are the place where you meet new people, where you share ideas, you discuss new things, you have new social experiences. Just because you're abstinent or you're controlling a particular type of behaviour shouldn't mean that you can't take a full part in that. So recovery is a crucial part, and we want recovery to be visible and available on a university campus. And so we have what is called Better Than Well. We were very fortunate to get a grant from a philanthropic foundation to start this. We started in September 2021, and the program is called Better Than Well, which is the name chosen by the students, because if you are in recovery from addiction, in my view, you are better than well, because you've not only reached the level of functioning that the rest of us who aren't in recovery have, but you've also had that experience of what it's like to be the other side. And that makes you, whether you like it or not, much more empathic and aware. And one of the key parts of recovery, we heard it again, connecting with other people, giving back to other people. So this is a major asset to the University of Birmingham and to any other university, having a recovery program on its campus. So what do we do? Well, here was my original slide that when I was pitching this to the university about what the elements we'd be creating in our program, and the bits in yellow are the bits we've done. So we have regular meetings every week. Anyone is welcome to join us. Friday evening at 5 o'clock, always the same. We have a celebration of recovery meeting, which is open to anyone that's either in recovery or knows someone who's in recovery, who is interested in learning about it. You're welcome to come along to that. We have meetings using different techniques of recovery, so smart recovery, the 12-step fellowships. We have meetings on campus, and we have access to meetings off campus. We have sober social events that are designed to have no drugs or alcohol, but to still be things you'd want to do, doing a variety of fun activities, all sorts of things that we've done that we also at the moment can subsidise. We've recently opened a flat on the Vale for students in recovery, and we hope to have ultimately that'll be filled with students. The university already offers quiet or more sober accommodation, but this is recovery accommodation, so you get the built-in support every day while you're there. And we also have a drop-in at the lodge next to the gate, just across the way, just outside. And Luke, who you'll meet in a minute, who's our project manager, who's a student in long-term recovery himself. Luke's available there most days, does one-to-one sessions with students, helps them with recovery planning. So this exists at the University of Birmingham. If you have, whatever stage you're at in this process, in that spectrum, personally, I'd be happy to speak to you. Luke would be happy to speak to you if you want help and guidance. If you're in abstinent recovery, or you consider yourself in recovery, you'd be welcome to join our program. In fact, I'd urge you to do so, because I think you'll find it helpful and supportive. And just a couple of things. We did quite a bit of work with our students in our first year on the program, and they said various things about what they were hoping to get from our program. I should say it's completely confidential. It's not run by the university technically. It's run by, I work for the university, but it's run within the university rather than for that. And absolutely, it's confidential. That would be a fundamental part of it. And I'll just finish up. I like putting this photo up here because Luke, I'll embarrass him, but Luke is, Luke won't mind me saying that 5 or 6 years ago, Luke was injecting drugs, homeless. Luke now has a first-class degree from the university. Luke has a master's from the university, and Luke was selected by the university, nothing to do with me, I didn't nominate him. He was selected by the university as one of the 20 people to carry the baton in the Commonwealth Games, the Queen's baton. And I think that's a really good example of where we need to get the message out that unfortunately addictive behaviours are common. They're out there. You've heard there's 1 in 10 people struggling with this on the campus. That's staff, students, and help is out there. And the good life, I don't like to end talks by quoting Morrissey, but the good life is out there somewhere. And we know where it is, and we can support you in that. And you shouldn't suffer in silence. Come and make contact with us, drop us an email, come and see Luke in the lodge, and we can support you if you need it. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll go to the Slido page. And what I'm going to do is ask Paula and Steve to come up to the front, and also Luke, who's with us. Now, Luke's got the Slido questions that are coming in on the laptop for people. So what we're going to do is just go through those. I'll come down here. We've got a couple of mics, and we've got about 20 minutes, so that's perfect. So I'll just give you those. So we're happy to take them from people here. So if you've got a question, do put your hand up. But do you want to start with one of the ones from there, Luke?
Okay, yes. So there's some themes that are coming up. There's quite a strong theme around how we could regulate both gambling and porn. There's an interesting one here. Sorry, it's moved on. Do we think gambling betting companies should take more responsibility for reducing addiction, like on cigarette packets?
Steve, I think that's one for you to start.
Yeah, well that's something that is massively part of the big review that's going on at the moment. There's lots of discussion about advertising, whether it should be restricted more. There is discussion about what role the industry should take in that. My kind of personal view is that actually the industry is an industry. The gambling industry is there to make money. That's kind of what they do. You know, they're listed companies with shareholders, so they're kind of obligated to make as much money as possible. What needs to be better put in place is the regulatory framework to restrict what the operators are able to do, because currently it's so. I mean, I'm not going to go massively into the history of all the gambling acts and why they were all changed and stuff, because to me it's super interesting, but we haven't got another 2 hours for me to talk about the Act of 1964, whichever one it was. But it basically all came in when the lottery came in 1994. The lottery was given lots of kind of privileges, if you want to call them that other parts of the gambling industry didn't have. So the gambling industry said, hold on a minute, this is not fair. Why can 16-year-olds do it? Why can you advertise on telly? Why are you able to have your draw on primetime TV on Saturday? So the new act was brought in partly in response to that, and it really kind of liberalised the government's approach to legislating gambling. And we're now in the process of updating that act, because that act, you know, it was first drawn up in about 2000, and it was published finally in 2005, and it talks more about fax machines than it does about online gambling, which gives you an idea of how kind of up to date it is as a piece of legislation.
It's known as the Analog Act in a digital world.
That's exactly what it's known as. Yeah. So we're currently, that is massively under review, and there's going to be, I suspect, quite a big shake-up of kind of the way that things are regulated, which will restrict kind of potentially what gambling companies are able to do in terms of what they can offer and how they can offer it and where they can offer it.
Okay, just to stick with that theme a little bit then, there is a question here. What can be done by the general public to change the way betting companies advertise gambling, i.e. lobbying the government to legislate against them? Is there something we can do about this?
The general public, I don't want to say no, because that sounds really negative, but there is lots of kind of lobby groups that are lobbying for change. Some of them, for example, the Big Step, they do lots of kind of walks between football clubs that are sponsored by gambling companies to raise awareness of gambling related harms and harms in the communities of those companies. There's other groups, for example, you may have come across Gambling with Lives, who are basically they're a group that represent parents who are bereaved by suicide. Their children have died from suicide because of gambling. And some of those groups are able to have been very successful actually in lobbying to get change within this area.
I should just say that Steve could. I know for a fact Steve could talk for hours about this, and it is a really interesting area. And there's a book we could recommend that is actually very good that came out fairly recently about the history of all of this. But what you should look at when you think about this is the change from tobacco smoking to alcohol to gambling. And I don't know. I mean, sex goes back even further, so that would be different.
Profession in the world.
But if you look at what happened with smoking, so again, I can show my age now, but when I was young, when I was your age, going to pubs and things, you'd come home. I've never smoked, but you'd come home at the end of the evening absolutely stinking of smoke because everyone smoked in pubs. Smoking was just everywhere. And in shops and on planes. And it seems incredible now. Cinemas, you'd go and watch a film in the cinema and you could barely see it sometimes because there was a fog of smoke hanging there. It seems incredible now. But tobacco smoking has effectively been run out of town by do-gooding public healthers like me and doctors and people that were concerned about health, because the tobacco in the Western world has pretty much had the full range of public health measures applied to it. So if you think about what's happened, they've increased the price massively through taxation, so they become prohibitively expensive. They've banned advertising. So again, when I was younger, every sports event was sponsored by Benson and Hedges or John Player Special or whatever. Now you can't even see the logos. You can't even see the images of the logo, the colours of the logos. Now you have gory pictures of lungs and things on cigarette packets. You've changed the ages that people can get access to. So it goes on and on and on. Every single, and I mean the most incredible thing was the smoking ban. If you'd have said to me, as I say, that they're going to ban smoking in public places, I'd just have laughed at you. But they've done it, and it has made a big difference. The thing is, we now know that the alcohol industry has learnt from that and has become quite sophisticated at repelling those public health measures. And the gambling industry, I would argue, is even further out there because they've made so much money so quickly that they are now in such a powerful position that it's very difficult. Policymakers find it very hard to legislate against them. There is plenty they could do if they were really worried about helping it. But Britain is one of the leading online gambling countries in the world, effectively, in terms of...
Can I just say something about porn? I just had 2 minutes on porn. Regulate the porn industry? At least there are gambling-aware campaigns. There's no porn-aware or wank-aware campaigns out there. I wonder if anyone's got that URL. I should try and find out. It is an absolute nightmare trying to regulate the porn industry, and of course, freedom, liberty, sexual rights, all that kind of stuff. And it's a real challenge because obviously a lot of people are able to enjoy porn without there being any issues. But it is such a moral topic anyway. And at least smoking you could never do online. You had to go and buy them. So, and the pornography industry worldwide is worth considerably more than the gambling industry in terms of the amount of money they make. And as I'm sure many of you know, porn is mostly free. It is, and the advertising behind it is all about getting you to the paid-for sites. Yeah, that is what it's there for, is to get you to the places where it's paid. The whole point is to escalate to get your money. Regrettably, some of it is also about getting you to the illegal stuff, because that you have to pay for. And because so much of it's on the dark web, and I don't think gambling's ever had to go to the dark web yet, but so much of it is also on the dark web as well, particularly the dark stuff. And regulating the dark web is something that is currently completely impossible, so I'm told by forensic police. So goodness, and some people still claim that porn isn't an addiction. You can't get addicted to it, which of course is what they used to say about cigarettes. Doctors used to advertise smoking on television adverts, and I suspect we will look back at porn one day and go, oh my goodness, what were we thinking? But there you go.
Okay, so on that, staying in that region, how long does it take to break porn addiction?
So I seem to remember there was a bit of research somewhere saying, and I'm very, the psychiatrist to my right might know more about this, in terms of the physical breaking of it, I seem to remember like 12 to 16 weeks of abstinence from something is meant to be quite significant in terms of beginning to change some of the neural pathways. But it's the psychological stuff that takes a long time. And I think I very much believe in Ed's saying and the whole principle of recovery, full recovery, recovery capital. I'm absolutely on board with that. I think the challenge is that you have got to change your relationship with your sexuality. So in some sense, those triggers are always going to be there. So you're going to need to know how you kind of manage that. And I think it's the fact that it's probably always going to be a weakness. I suspect this cough that I am struggling to get rid of 4 weeks after being ill is because I was a smoker for 25 years. Yeah, that's the legacy it's left me with, is that this is actually a weakness of mine. And I suspect even when you're in full recovery from porn addiction, you're one step away from slipping again. Yeah, I know that if I started smoking again, I'd be off. Oh, e-cigarettes. Evil, the devil. So I think that's the challenge. It's kind of every day you are in recovery. But I as Ed said, it's an absolute positive in the same way as if you were recovering from cancer, every day you're in recovery. No one sees that as a bad thing. Every day you're in recovery from porn addiction. And frankly, you can do it just like that. You can stop just like that. I've known many people that have. But you need to work it. You need to want it.
What I would say sort of universally about addiction is that if you look at pretty much any study done anywhere in the world, and vast majority of these studies are done with drugs and alcohol because the research around gambling and other behavioural addictions is relatively new, it shows universally the same pattern, that people that maybe have an episode of treatment or do it themselves and manage to stop, 2/3 of them at least will have gone back to it within a year, usually between 6 months and 12 months. And that seems to be a regular pattern. There seems to be a sort of, the first 6 months can often be a sort of twilight period, a honeymoon period where things massively improve and you feel confident and much happier. And then you perhaps fail to pay attention to the bigger picture and the wider issues of your recovery, and you end up going back to using. Once you get out, the good news is it's very, very similar to cancer that was mentioned before. So if I was treating someone's cancer as a doctor, and I wouldn't dare claim that I'd cured them until they'd been free of that cancer for 5 years. That's the established norm, because statistically, once the cancer hasn't come back for 5 years, your risk of it coming back is back to the population level of getting that cancer. And actually, it turns out addiction is very, very similar. So if you're abstinent, if you're in recovery, in control in recovery for 5 years, you most likely won't, your risk of going back to it has gone back to the general population risk. But in between those, that's where the recovery bit works. So that first year is important, but also that the second and third year. And that's what I mean. It's a bit of Luke may want to comment on this, but that.
Yeah, I
think you've got to find out what you're anaesthetising against. I think that's one of the challenges, is that often you can't do the work until the anaesthetic's worn off, and sometimes it's 6, 8, 12 weeks when the anaesthetic's worn off, and then you realise you've got a real problem with your anger, or you really do suffer with anxiety, and that's when you've got to really find the other ways of managing that stuff. But early days, you don't yet experience it.
Yeah, in the kind of recovery community circles, a lot of the stuff is said kind of colloquially that you'll hear from researchers and psychiatrists and the like. And 5 years is a bit of a milestone, really, that is spoken about when you're past the early stages of recovery. And yes, you're starting to look at the other areas. Sometimes we call it going for outside help, or going to see a psychotherapist, or this kind of thing. So very often what you hear about in places like universities or psychiatrists, it plays out very much the same in recovery communities, which is good to know, I suppose, that there is actually some substance to all of this research and stuff.
It wasn't a waste of time.
Yeah. Okay. There are some quite deeply philosophical questions here, I have to say. I know, I'm not sure. I mean, there is one here which I'm kind of interested in, and I feel I'm not sure I should ask, but your thoughts on Sam Harris's argument for no free will, and what implications this has for behavioural addiction. So I guess that is the idea that there isn't actually any such thing as free will. So how, what does that, how does that play into the issue of addictions?
Sounds like a bloody good excuse to me.
Yeah.
Let's have a philosophical debate about it rather than actually talking about the individual. I think that's a red herring.
Well, I would say actually on that point, we've got 5 minutes. And I dare say we're not going to. But the topic of addiction, if you're interested, I spoke at a launch of a book that came out last year, which it must be 500 pages long, which is a book with probably 30 or 40 chapters, each with a different view on addiction. In fact, it starts off with 4 or 5 of the big American researchers talking about that brain disease model that I showed earlier. And then the rest of the book is about why that's completely wrong. And there's loads of other ways to think about this. And I would say this is why I love working in this area and doing research in this area, because there are so many different ways of coming at it. And to be honest, they're all right. And I think it comes back to that thing that there's no one pathway to recovery, because everyone's journey to it is different. We can give you some suggestions and some things that statistically help you, but they don't necessarily work for everyone. And that's completely avoided the deeply philosophical question, Luke. Next.
Okay. Perhaps a good one to kind of end with is...
was there anyone actually in the room that wanted to ask a question?
Actually,
Sorry, I know you may have put them on there, but just to check that there wasn't people that wanted to... Yeah?
So, obviously, understanding that sort of every behaviour is learned and reinforced, and that reinforcement leads to sort of some form of mood modification. Isn't it really, are we not going to lose the heterogeneity of the differences these things have, and the different sort of meanings we have for people, by grouping them all together under addiction? So we know that in gambling, there's some unique features that you don't see in alcohol addiction or in porn addiction. I am a self-harm researcher, and I know self-harm has been said to be an addictive behavior.
Yep.
I do not personally believe that to be the exact situation. So by grouping all of these very different behaviors under the term addiction, are we not risking losing that difference, and then therefore actually losing part of the picture, part of the knowledge and the ways of helping people? Sorry, that was really long.
Yeah, so just perhaps people online haven't heard that question. So you're saying that there's a danger that you lose the nuanced picture by putting everything... sort of the question is eventually everything going to be an addiction? Can every behaviour become addictive? And in which case, does anyone want to have a go at answering that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a definitive answer, but it is something that within the behavioural addictions field we are trying to be very conscious of, because behavioural addictions do have certain features that are different from substance use disorders. So at the moment, we will only find behavioural addictions accepted into the kind of wider academic and addiction researchers community if we tick all the boxes that came before us in substance use behaviour. So gambling disorder was the only one accepted into the DSM because of the strength of the neurological research, for example, that shows, okay, there's similar brain patterns in when you're presented with these stimuli. So it is something we have to be aware of, partly because there's a guy who talks regularly on the behavioural addictions conferences who says if you apply all these traditional substance use criteria, you can pretty much say that anyone is addicted to anything. And the example he uses is fishing. He says he needs to go fishing for longer, he has to catch bigger fish, and he thinks about fishing when he's supposed to be at work. And if you apply all those criteria to a behaviour, you can make anything an addiction. So we do have to be careful, I think, within the behavioural addictions area, that we are appreciating some of the nuances and the distinguishing features of behavioural addictions that are there in addition to the kind of the more traditional substance use addiction criteria.
There's also the issue that comes to mind that is the addiction the problem, or is that the response that's to another issue that's gone wrong?
I'd wholeheartedly agree with that. I think ultimately addictions and compulsions are a symptom of another problem. And that's the real common ground. So there may be some neurological similarities, but they're all maladaptive coping strategies. And some are more harmful than others. Injecting heroin is more harmful than watching pornography. I think there's little doubt over that in terms of the direct impact to somebody's health. Coffee's addictive. We all know that coffee's addictive. But do they have 12-step groups for caffeine anonymous yet? Probably in the States. But they certainly don't over here, because actually the consequences aren't as great. So I think the thing they really do have in common is that they are symptoms of a life that's not being managed well. And I would say that is true of self-harm, but it's absolutely important, essential that we do recognise the differences as well as the similarities.
So we've ticked over to 4 o'clock now, and I think I'll be in trouble if we could probably run on for a couple of hours with the questions. I'd just like to thank everyone that's come to the session today. Thank everyone that's watching online. Please encourage others to watch the recording of this if they might be interested. And we'll be hanging around for a bit at the end if anyone wants to come and ask us or follow up on any of those things. But thank you very much to the UOB Festival for organising this, and thank you for your interest.